The world in 1800 was vast and restless, 1,000 heartbeats echoing across continents, not yet connected by steam or steel. Empires stretched and faltered, kingdoms dreamed and crumbled. The old world whispered its last songs as the new world stirred awake. It was an age of candles and quills, of distant wars and quiet prayers, of farmers who rose with the sun, and astronomers who watched it set with wonder. In the great cities, coaches clattered over cobblestones. In the countryside, silence was broken only by the wind through the fields. The Industrial Revolution was a rumor in some places, a reality in others. In Paris, scholars debated reason and faith. In Edo, poets wrote of the fleeting cherry blossom. In the Caribbean, the drums of rebellion echoed. And across the endless African plains, ancient kingdoms traded gold, salt, and stories under the stars. But history is not made only by kings and generals. It is made in the small hours, in the whispered thoughts of ordinary souls who never dreamed their lives would outlast them. Tonight we will walk among them. We will rise with a peasant girl in rural France, sail with a fisherman in Edo Bay, ride through the dust of Cairo, and listen to the quiet hopes of a freedman in the Americas. Each story a thread, woven into the same human tapestry, the world as it was in the year 1800. The world turns, the sun touches the edge of Europe, and dawn breaks over France. In a quiet village near the Loire, a young woman opens her eyes to another uncertain day. Welcome to History for Sleep, where the past drifts softly into dreams. Do not forget to write out in the comments where you are listening from. I'd love to know in which places around the world I am helping people sleep even more soundly. Plus, if you like what I do here, subscribe now, and let tomorrow's dream begin where this one ends. Chapter 1. France, 1800. Marie and the Morning Fog. The fog hung low over the river valley, soft and silver in the early light. The roosters had not yet crowed, but Marie was already awake. She had slept in her shift by the hearth, her mother's shawl around her shoulders, the air still carrying the chill of the night before. Her world was small, the cottage, the mill, the church spire beyond the elms. Yet beyond those hills, everything was changing. France was still catching its breath from revolution. The echo of the guillotine had faded, but the memory of it lingered like smoke. Marie's father had once worked the land for a nobleman who no longer existed. The estate was seized, divided, and now the land was theirs, though the taxes bit just as deep. Her older brother had gone to fight under Bonaparte's tricolor, leaving behind his hat, a small wooden cross, and the uneasy silence that came with waiting. She rose quietly so as not to wake her mother, and stoked the fire with practiced care. Outside, the world was pale with mist. The hens rustled. Somewhere a dog barked, distant, mournful, familiar. She stepped outside to fetch water from the well. The handle creaked as the bucket descended, the echo of it bouncing softly in the stone shaft. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke from neighboring cottages. Marie was 20, but her hands were already rough from labor. Her hair, a dull brown like the soil, was tied with a bit of twine. She had once dreamed of Paris, of seeing the world she heard about in travelers' tales, but dreams were luxuries in this village. Bread came first. As she carried the water back, she paused to look at the fields. The fog was lifting now, revealing rows of wheat stubble, black crows pecking among them. The frost had bitten hard that winter. Many said the harvest would fail again if the weather didn't turn. "Bon matin, Marie," a voice called. Old Monsieur Lenoir from across the lane. His back was bent like a question mark, his breath puffing white in the morning air. She smiled faintly. "Bon matin, monsieur." Her voice carried warmth, though the world around her felt cold. "Your brother," he said, leaning on his cane. "Any letters?" She shook her head. Not since last spring. He sighed, as though the war were a weather that would never end. They say Bonaparte will bring peace, he muttered, half to himself. But peace never comes cheap. Marie nodded, but said nothing. She knew better than to hope too loudly. Inside, her mother was awake now, stirring the pot of yesterday's broth. The fire crackled. A wooden spoon clinked softly against the pot's rim. For a moment it felt like the old world again, before soldiers, before taxes, before the revolution had turned everything upside down. As they ate in silence, a knock came at the door. Marie's heart jumped. Few visited at dawn. It was a courier, mud-spattered, exhausted, his tricolor sash dulled by dust. "A letter," he said, pulling one from his satchel. Her hands trembled as she took it, the seal marked with a faded emblem she didn't recognize. She broke it open with careful fingers. Her brother had written in a hurried scrawl, the ink blotted and uneven. He was alive, stationed near Milan, part of Bonaparte's new campaign. He spoke of long marches, bitter cold, but also of pride, that France was rising again. Marie read the words aloud to her mother, her voice wavering between joy and worry. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully, pressed it to her chest and whispered a prayer. Outside, the fog had lifted completely. The first rays of sunlight touched the fields, and the Loire shimmered like glass. For the first time in months, Marie smiled, not because she believed in war or in glory, but because for one fragile morning in 1800, hope felt real again. The sun climbs higher, gilding the rooftops of France. Beyond the sea, it glances across deserts and mountains, awakening other souls beneath the same sky. While Marie tends her fields, another life stirs, far away, where the wind carries the scent of incense and salt water. Chapter 2, Japan, 1800, Takeshi and the Morning Tide. The morning came quietly to Edo Bay. Mist rose from the water, curling like breath over the dark waves. The air smelled of salt, kelp, and the faint sweetness of burning cedar from the shore. Takeshi pushed his small fishing boat from the shallows, the cool water numbing his feet. He was 30, with sun-hardened skin and calloused hands that had shaped nets since childhood. His father's boat had once been larger, painted red and black in the old style, but the storms of 2 winters past had claimed it. Now he worked alone in a vessel patched with hope and rope, barely wide enough for 2. Edo, the shogun's city, lay just beyond the morning haze, a sprawl of tile roofs and wooden bridges where over 1 million souls lived. Yet here on the bay, it felt like another world. The cries of gulls echoed over the water. The rhythmic splash of the oar steadied his breathing. Takeshi's mind drifted to his wife, Aiko, still asleep at home. She would rise soon to prepare rice and miso, their small boy tugging at her sleeve. Life was simple but measured. Every coin counted, every meal shared with care. The world beyond Japan was a mystery to most. The Tokugawa shogunate had sealed the nation to foreign influence, save for a sliver of Dutch trade through Nagasaki. Yet rumors drifted in with the tides, stories of new ships, Western inventions, and kingdoms across the sea. Takeshi had never seen a foreigner, but sometimes, when the wind carried the faint smell of oil and gunpowder from the harbor, he imagined distant lands where people spoke in thunder and light. He cast his net. The weights sank in a perfect circle, disappearing into the blue. He waited, listening to the slow creak of the hull. The sea was kind this morning, soft waves, a sky the color of porcelain. He thought of his father's words, the sea gives and the sea takes. Bow to both. So Takeshi bowed slightly toward the horizon before drawing the line. The net came up heavy, shimmering with sardines. Enough for today, maybe enough for tomorrow. He smiled faintly, a rare thing for him. The sound of oars reached his ears. Another fisherman, Genji, rowing closer, his boat half hidden by fog. "You're early, Takeshi," Genji called, grinning through missing teeth. "The sea's still dreaming." Takeshi shrugged. "Then I'll wake it gently." They laughed, a sound swallowed by the mist. By mid-morning the sun broke free, turning the bay into a mirror. The fishermen gathered near the docks, their nets drying on bamboo poles. The chatter was easy, familiar. The same talk of tides, catches, and taxes owed to the local magistrate. Beyond the waterfront, Edo pulsed with quiet industry. Merchants hauled rice bales along the Sumida River. Women in indigo robes washed clothes on the banks. Samurai in layered kimono passed silent but watched, their topknots catching the sun. Takeshi walked home through the narrow streets of his village, carrying his basket of fish balanced on one shoulder. The scent of grilled mackerel and miso soup drifted from open doorways. The temple bell rang, marking the hour, a soft reminder that time here was measured not by clocks, but by rhythm. At his home, Aiko greeted him with a bow and a smile, their son darting between her legs like a small, bright bird. Takeshi set the fish down, ruffled the boy's hair, and sat cross-legged near the hearth. Aiko poured tea, green and delicate, from the same clay pot her mother had used. "The magistrate's men came," she said quietly. "They spoke of new taxes for the fishing villages. They say it's to strengthen the shogun's navy." Takeshi's smile faded. "The navy will not feed us." She nodded, eyes down. There was little more to say. They had endured droughts, storms, and rumors before. Japan was changing, though few could name how. That night, as the family slept beneath a roof of thin thatch, Takeshi lay awake, listening to the wind off the bay. Somewhere in the distance, a drum echoed. Perhaps a guard's watch, perhaps something older. He thought of the Dutch ships at Nagasaki, of stories told by sailors who'd seen the world beyond Japan's shores. He wondered what it would be like to leave, to see the lands where the sun set instead of rose. But then, the tide called softly outside, the voice he knew best. He closed his eyes and listened, the sea whispering through the night, eternal and forgiving. The waves roll westward, carrying the dawn across the great ocean. By the time light reaches the coasts of Africa, it is already heavy with heat and the scent of red dust. There, another morning begins, in a kingdom both ancient and enduring. Chapter 3, West Africa, 1800, Kofi and the Red Dust Morning. The first light of day spread slowly across the savannah, turning the tall grass to gold. Kofi stood outside his family's compound, the earth warm beneath his bare feet. He was 16, thin and wiry, with eyes that caught everything. The way the wind curved through the millet, the shimmer of distant smoke, the far-off cry of cattle. His village lay along the banks of the Volta River, part of a web of small communities between the Ashanti Kingdom, to the west, and the territories that traders called the Gold Coast. The air smelled of wood smoke and palm wine, of clay ovens baking yams for breakfast. He could already hear the sound of the women pounding fufu, rhythmic and strong, like a heartbeat. His mother's voice rose among them, calling for calm as younger girls giggled at some private joke. Kofi tied his tunic at the waist and lifted the wooden yoke onto his shoulders. 2 gourds hung from either end, sloshing softly as he walked toward the river. The morning was quiet except for the humming of insects and the distant beat of drums from another village. A message, maybe a ceremony. By the river he met Kwame, his friend since childhood, already knee-deep in the water casting a net. "You're late," Kwame teased. "The sun was lazy," Kofi replied, grinning. They worked in silence, pulling the net through the shallows. silver fish darting beneath their fingers. Beyond them, the river stretched like a ribbon of glass, the forest breathing mist from its banks. But beneath the calm, tension pulsed. The elders spoke of new trade routes opening inland, of caravans bringing salt, cloth, and iron from the north. They also whispered of the white men on the coast, still hungry for bodies despite the king's promises. The Atlantic slave trade was dying in law, not yet in practice. Kofi's father had seen their ships once, dark hulks against the horizon, and said they were like spirits that swallowed men whole. The elders warned the youth not to wander too far, not to trust strange traders. After the morning catch, Kofi and Kwame carried their baskets back, laughter returning as easily as breath. They passed a group of hunters preparing for the forest, their spears gleaming with new forged iron. Beyond them, a caravan rested. Men with turbans and camels from the north, their saddlebags heavy with salt and beads. One of the traders smiled at Kofi. "Strong boy," he said in accented Twi. "You could work with us, carry goods, earn coin." Kofi smiled politely but stepped back. His father's words echoed, "Be polite to those who travel far, but remember, not all journeys bring you home." In the afternoon he joined his father in repairing the roof of their hut. The dry season had cracked the clay. As they worked, the old man spoke of the world changing, of rumors that the British far across the sea now sent ships to stop the trade, instead of feed it. "They say their king forbids it," his father said, "but ships do not always obey kings." Kofi nodded, pretending to understand, but his thoughts drifted elsewhere, to the horizon, to what lay beyond it. He had never seen the sea, only heard of it in stories, a place where the world ended and began again. That night, as drums rose over the fields and the village danced in celebration of the harvest, Kofi watched the sparks lift into the sky like fireflies. He thought of the fishermen on the coast, the soldiers in the forests, the traders on the long roads. The world, he felt, was larger than his eyes could see, but it was turning and he could feel its pull. He didn't know that within his lifetime, strangers would arrive wearing red coats and carrying maps instead of chains, that the kings of the coast would sign papers they could not read, that the world would come rushing in, changing everything. For now he only heard the steady rhythm of drums, blending with the wind, carrying through the dark, a sound older than empires. The red dust of Africa drifts eastward on the wind, crossing oceans and deserts. By the time it reaches the Middle East, it mingles with the scent of frankincense and spice rising over the domes of Cairo as the call to prayer awakens another world. Chapter 4, Egypt, 1800, Amira and the River of Kings. The dawn over Cairo was a muted gold, the kind that blurred the boundary between dream and waking. Amira stepped out onto the narrow balcony of her family's home, overlooking the twisting alleyways of the old city. Below her, Cairo was stirring, merchants lifting shutters, donkeys clattering on stone, the faint hum of voices before the day began. She drew her shawl tighter. Even in early morning, the air carried the warmth of the desert and the smell of the river, that endless ribbon of life they called the Nile. From where she stood, she could see its glint between the rooftops, moving slowly beneath the haze of sunrise. Amira was 24. Her family traded textiles brought in by caravan from Upper Egypt, bolts of cotton dyed with indigo and saffron. Her father had once spoken proudly of their business, but now he worried. The Ottomans still ruled, but French soldiers had marched through these same streets 2 years before, and everything since had felt uncertain. She remembered their arrival, the strange blue coats, the music of brass and drums echoing through the mosques. They had come speaking a language few understood, but carrying a promise of change. Some saw them as liberators, others as intruders. The soldiers were gone now, defeated and replaced by new powers. But Cairo still trembled with their ghost. From the balcony she watched the first feluccas slide along the Nile, white sails catching the sun. The call to prayer rose, long, haunting, beautiful. The city seemed to hold its breath. Her mother's voice came from within the house. "Amira, the market!" Amira smiled and stepped back inside. Her younger brother Malik sat on the floor sorting dyed thread into bundles. "Do you think the French will come back?" he asked without looking up. "I think they left enough trouble behind," she replied softly. "Now we must find our own way." She wrapped her headscarf and lifted the basket of cloth. The walk to the Khan el-Khalili bazaar was short but winding, through lanes perfumed with cardamom sweat, past men in turbans debating news from the mosque, past beggars who stretched out hands without words. At the bazaar, colors exploded. Copper lamps gleamed beside baskets of pomegranates. Traders shouted in Arabic, Turkish, and Greek. A scribe sat beneath an archway, writing letters for those who could not. Amira laid out her wares, fine woven cotton, smooth as river silk. A merchant approached, his robes immaculate, his beard trimmed close. "From Upper Egypt?" he asked, fingering the cloth. "Yes," she replied. "Dyed in Asyut, spun by hand." He nodded, impressed. "Beautiful. But the times are strange. Gold is scarce, and coin loses value faster than cloth fades." "Then perhaps we trade," Amira said. "2 bolts for your oil." He smiled. "You bargain like a man. I bargain like someone who must eat." They exchanged goods and polite nods. As she packed her basket again, she noticed a boy across the street selling small scraps of paper, drawings of soldiers, ships, and maps. She bought one out of curiosity. It was a crude sketch of a machine, a boat with wheels, labeled in strange script. "The French made them," the boy said. "Boats that move without wind." Amira traced the lines with her finger, wondering if such things could be real. A world where boats sailed without sails. What else might change next? By evening, she walked home along the riverbank. The sunset turned the Nile to molten gold. Fishermen were pulling in their nets. Children splashed near the reeds. She stopped beside an old man mending a felucca sail. "Good wind today," he said, nodding at the river. "Always," she replied. "The Nile never changes." He laughed. "Ah, but everything else does." As night fell, Amira sat on her rooftop watching lanterns flicker across the city. Somewhere beyond the horizon, new empires were stirring, new machines were being born. Cairo, ancient and eternal, waited, its people holding on to what they knew, even as the world shifted under their feet. The wind carried the smell of the river northward, across the sea, where another empire rose under the weight of industry and smoke. And there, far from the sands and the call to prayer, the morning light found a soot-stained city that never slept. Chapter 5. England 1800, Thomas and the Smoke of Progress. The first whistle of the morning train had not yet come, but the city was already awake. London in 1800 smelled of soot and steam, the breath of factories and the tang of the Thames. The fog rolled thick over the river, swallowing the outlines of masts and chimneys until the whole world looked half-made, half-remembered. Thomas Hale buttoned his coat as he stepped into the narrow street. He was 32, an engineer's apprentice in a foundry near Southwark. His hands bore the stains of iron and grease, though he washed them every night until the skin cracked. He had once dreamed of becoming a draftsman to sketch bridges and machines instead of building them, but dreams had no wages, and rent was due every Saturday. The cobblestones glistened with last night's rain. A horse-drawn cart creaked past. the driver half asleep beneath his cap. The smell of fresh bread mingled with coal smoke from 10,000 hearths. In a window nearby, a candle burned beside a worn Bible. London was vast, but every street seemed to echo the same rhythm: work, eat, sleep, repeat. As Thomas crossed the bridge, he saw the grey blur of the new factories rising like fortresses of brick and glass. The Industrial Revolution had found its pulse here. Steam engines clattering, looms humming, the city alive with invention and exhaustion. The river carried barges heavy with iron, timber, and rumour. Men spoke of machines that could weave faster than 10 workers, ships that might one day move without sails, even engines that could roll along rails of iron. At the foundry, the day began with the shriek of metal. Sparks burst in showers as hammers struck steel. Thomas joined the others in lifting a mold, his muscles burning under the weight. The air was thick with smoke and sweat, but there was pride in it too. The knowledge that they were building something new, something the world had never seen. During the midday break, he sat on a pile of coal outside, eating a heel of bread and cheese. Beside him, an older worker named Mr. Crawley wiped his brow. "They say Mr. Watt's engines will drive ships across the world," Crawley muttered. "No need for wind at all." "Imagine that." Thomas smiled faintly. "A world without sails," he said. "What next? A world without sleep." Crawley laughed, then coughed until he spat black dust. "Progress don't sleep, lad. Never has." When the shift ended, Thomas crossed back through the maze of narrow streets toward the river. The afternoon light broke through in slants, cutting the fog into ribbons. Children ran barefoot through puddles, their laughter thin against the roar of the city. A woman sold papers by the corner, shouting headlines about wars on the continent. A general named Bonaparte, rising fast. Thomas bought a paper, though he could barely afford it, and read as he walked. Across the Channel, Europe was burning again. Empires rose and fell, while in London, the factories simply burned coal. He stopped by the water's edge, watching the tide carry flecks of oil and wood downstream. The sun, red through the haze, dipped behind the skyline of steeples and smoke. That night, back in his small rented room, he unfolded a drawing he had hidden beneath his cot, a bridge of his own design, an arc of iron over water. He had sketched it in secret, each line neat and steady despite his weary hands. He imagined it standing somewhere beyond London, spanning a clean river under open skies. He blew out the candle and lay back, the smell of metal still on his skin. Outside, the city hummed, a restless machine that never stopped turning. Beyond the sea, where the smoke could not reach, a different fire burned. The new world was young and raw, its promise wrapped in struggle and freedom. As England's factories dimmed into night, the sun rose again across the Atlantic, lighting the red fields of Virginia and the hopes of a man named Samuel. Chapter 6. The United States, 1800. Samuel and the Dawn of a Nation. The first light came slanting through the cracks of the cabin wall, painting stripes across the dirt floor. Samuel Carter stirred awake to the sound of roosters and the low rumble of wind moving through the pines. The Virginia air was heavy with spring, damp, sweet, alive with promise. He rose quietly so as not to wake his wife, Ruth, and their 2 children sleeping in the loft. The cabin was small, but it was theirs, built with his own hands from felled oak. Outside, the fields stretched wide and red, newly plowed and waiting for seed. Samuel was 37, born a free man in a land that was still learning what freedom meant. His father had been enslaved on a tobacco plantation near the James River, but gained liberty years before Samuel's birth. The family had stayed, building a modest life on rented land, their papers of freedom carefully guarded like treasure. As Samuel stepped into the cool morning, he took a moment to breathe in the silence. The revolution was long past, yet the echoes of it still reached here. In the talk of politics, in the new flag that hung over courthouse doors, in the uncertain hope that freedom could mean the same for all. He hitched the mule and began turning the soil, slow and steady. Each step was a rhythm, the plow slicing the earth, the air filling with the scent of clay. In the distance, the river shimmered under the early sun. By midday, he paused to rest beneath the shade of a hickory tree. From here he could see the Carter homestead, his own small square of a country still defining itself. His wife was hanging laundry outside, her dress pale blue against the green fields. Their son chased a chicken with a stick, laughing so hard he nearly tripped. Samuel smiled, though a heaviness lingered in his chest. Word had come through travelers and traders that new territories were opening westward, lands said to be fertile and free. But men like him faced risk at every turn. Freedom was fragile. Even a false accusation could send it crumbling. In town that evening, the tavern hummed with talk of politics. A man read aloud from a paper about President John Adams and his quarrels with Jefferson's supporters. Samuel sat near the back, listening but silent. For him, politics was distant thunder, important, yes, but far from the soil he tilled each day. Outside, the night air was soft, the stars sharp above the trees. He met his friend, Isaiah, a blacksmith, walking home from the forge. "You hear what they're saying?" Isaiah asked, lowering his voice. "There's talk of new states out west. Some say they'll be free, some say they won't." Samuel nodded slowly. "Freedom's a word with too many meanings," he said. Isaiah laughed without humor. "Ain't that the truth?" When Samuel returned home, his wife had lit a single candle. The children were asleep, their faces peaceful in the dim light. He sat beside her, took her hand, and said quietly, "Maybe one day we'll go west, start fresh." Ruth smiled faintly. "And what will we find there?" He looked toward the dark horizon beyond their window. "Maybe just more land. But maybe something more than that." She leaned her head against his shoulder. The candle flame flickered, throwing gentle light across the wooden walls. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain from the mountains. The night settled deep and still, and far to the south, across jungles and mountains, another dawn was rising, one that would soon shake the old empires of Europe and the Americas alike. In the highlands of South America, a man named Diego lifted his gaze to a sky split by condors and thought of freedom in a language older than nations. Chapter 7. South America, 1800. Diego and the Wind of the Andes. The first light crept over the Andes like a slow-spreading fire. Peaks turned gold, then white, as mist coiled through the valleys below. Diego adjusted the strap of his pack and looked eastward, where the mountains fell away toward the plains of what the Spaniards called Nueva Granada. He stood still for a moment, breathing in the thin air, the scent of cold stone, wild mint, and smoke from far-off fires. He was 28, a mule driver by trade, a dreamer by birth. The trail beneath him twisted like a serpent through the highlands, a narrow ribbon carved by centuries of footsteps, Inca, Spaniard, rebel, priest. Today, it carried him and 6 loaded mules bearing sacks of cocoa, silver ore, and letters bound for the coast. Below, the village of San Miguel was waking. A few thatched roofs gleamed wet with dew. The church bell rang once, hollow and slow. Somewhere a flute played, a melody older than the Spanish tongue. Diego's companion, an older man named Mateo, spat into the dust and grinned. "The mountain tests us today," he said in Quechua. The air smells of change. Diego nodded. He had heard the same whispers for months, talk of uprisings, of Creole leaders plotting independence in the cities, of Spain weakened by war. But here, in the mountains, life followed the rhythm of the land. Revolutions came like storms, distant thunder that might never reach their peaks. They led the mules upward. Stones clattered under hooves, echoing into the deep. The path was narrow, bordered by cliffs that fell away into cloud. To the left, terraces of maize curved down the slope like ancient scars. Women worked silently there, their skirts bright as wildflowers against the brown earth. By midday they reached a rest post, a small hut where travelers could buy soup and rest their animals. A boy of no more than 10 ran to meet them, eyes bright. "From Quito?" he asked. "From Cuenca," Diego replied, tossing him a copper coin. "And you, news from below?" The boy's grin widened. "They say the people march in Caracas. They say the Creoles speak of liberty." Mateo laughed, low and rough. "Liberty?" he said. "That word has a long climb before it reaches these heights." But Diego said nothing. The word lingered in his mind, libertad, sharp, unfamiliar, almost dangerous. When they continued, the afternoon turned fierce. The wind rose, carrying dust and chill. One mule stumbled near a ridge, nearly tumbling, and Diego steadied it with both hands. The beast's flank trembled. Its eyes were wide with fear. He whispered to it softly, old words from his grandmother's tongue, words of calm and faith. By sunset, they reached the high pass. Below them, the world unfolded. Valleys painted in shadow, a river glinting like a silver thread. The sky burned crimson, then violet. Diego stood still, awed. In that moment he felt the immensity of the world and his small place within it, and yet he felt the wind whisper something larger. "Someday," Mateo said quietly beside him, "these lands will belong to no king." Diego looked at the horizon. "Maybe," he said, "but who will they belong to then?" Neither answered. The mules shifted, the bells on their harnesses chiming faintly. As darkness fell, the men made camp among the rocks. They shared bread, a little coffee, and silence. The stars appeared, so many they seemed to press close, as if listening. Diego watched them long after Mateo slept. Somewhere beyond those peaks, cities were stirring, revolts were whispered, and nations were waiting to be born. He did not know that within 20 years, the mountains he crossed would echo with the footsteps of soldiers fighting for a new world. That his own son would one day carry a musket instead of a pack. For now, he lay beside the fire, the thin wind singing through the stones, and dreamed of valleys without masters. The flames flickered and died, and night stretched westward over the ocean. There, across the great Pacific, dawn touched another world, one of islands and coral, where a young woman stood on the shore watching sails she did not recognize approach from the horizon. Chapter 8. The Pacific, 1800, Leilani and the White Sails. The morning broke like a whisper over the Pacific, soft gold light spilling over waves that had traveled farther than memory. On the island of Kauai, Leilani stood barefoot in the sand, her hair blown back by the warm trade wind. The tide curled around her ankles, cool and alive. Above her, seabirds wheeled against the dawn. She was 19, daughter of a fisherman, granddaughter of a kahuna healer. Her village sat between the green mountains and the glittering sea, that narrow place where the world seemed whole. She had never left the island, but the ocean was her horizon, vast, unknowable, infinite. This morning, something broke its line. Far beyond the reef, strange sails moved, tall, white, angular, unlike any canoe or island vessel. The elders had warned her generation of such sights. The world beyond the horizon had grown restless, they said. Foreign ships crossed the sea now more often, bringing iron, muskets, and sickness in equal measure. Her father appeared beside her, silent for a moment, then said, "Those are not our sails, I know," she whispered. "They come closer each season." He nodded slowly. "The Alii will send men to greet them, perhaps to trade, perhaps to warn." The sails grew larger as the morning burned brighter. By the time the sun stood high, the ships were anchored beyond the reef, and a small boat was rowing toward shore. Leilani and the other villagers gathered along the beach, their faces half curious, half afraid. The strangers came dressed in cloths that shimmered like moonlight, their skin pale, their language harsh and rhythmic. One held out a silver coin, gleaming, and pointed toward coconuts and fish. The Ali, tall and stern, stepped forward and nodded in measured grace. Gifts were exchanged, fruit, cloth, shells. Then came the iron. Knives sharper than volcanic glass, nails smoother than bone, mirrors that caught the sunlight like trapped stars. The children gasped, reaching for the glittering objects before being pulled back by their mothers. Leilani's father muttered, "The gods did not shape those things." But Leilani couldn't look away. In the polished surface of the mirror, she saw her face, and behind it, the sails, white and endless. For days, the ships stayed offshore, their presence a question no one could answer. Men rowed out to trade fish for cloth. Others returned with tales of guns and tobacco, of men who prayed to a single god and wrote their words on paper. At night, the elders gathered by the fire, speaking in low tones. The old priest said the balance of the islands was changing, that strangers carried not only goods, but spirits unknown to the ancestors. Leilani listened from the shadows. She thought of the mirror, of her reflection blending with the image of the ship, and wondered what part of her belonged to the sea and what part to the horizon. On the fifth day, the wind turned. The sails unfurled, catching it like wings, and the ships drifted eastward, shrinking until they were only white specks on a blue canvas. The island exhaled. The villagers returned to their routines, weaving nets, tending taro, mending canoes, yet an unease lingered, like a faint tremor beneath the earth. That evening, Leilani walked alone along the beach. She picked up a piece of driftwood that had fallen from the strangers' boats, pale, smooth, unlike any she had seen. She turned it over in her hands and whispered a prayer to the ocean. Change, she thought, was like the tide. It could not be held back. She watched the horizon until darkness fell, the stars emerging one by one, the same stars her ancestors had followed across the sea. Somewhere beyond them, another world waited, already stirring with noise and light. The winds that had carried the white sails now drifted westward again, toward the edges of the Asian continent, to a land vast, restless, and rising under a dynasty that watched the world with wary eyes. Chapter 9. China, 1800, Li Wei and the Empire of Stillness. The morning mist clung to the rice paddies like breath on glass. Li Wei stepped barefoot into the flooded field, water cool around his ankles, the reflection of the sky rippling with every movement. Frogs croaked from the dikes. A bamboo flute sounded faintly from a nearby hill where a shepherd guided his goats. The world, at this hour, was still, perfectly balanced between silence and labor. He was 25, a farmer in the southern province of Jiangxi, where the hills rose like folded silk, and every inch of soil was measured by the weight of hunger. His family had tilled this same land for generations under the Qing emperors, sending grain to tax collectors who rarely left their horses. Li Wei's father had once fought in the White Lotus uprisings that shook the northern provinces. He returned scarred and quiet, teaching his son that peace was a fragile thread. As the sun lifted, the mist burned away, revealing endless terraces gleaming like mirrors. Li Wei bent to the work. Beside him, his younger sister May carried a wicker basket of seedlings, her feet sinking into the mud. "Do you think the harvest will be good?" she asked. "If heaven wills," he said simply. It was not faith so much as habit, the only way to make sense of the world's uncertainty. By mid-morning, a peddler's cart rattled down the dusty road above the fields, bells jingling. He shouted news from the county seat. The emperor in Beijing had declared new decrees on trade. Foreign ships, British, Portuguese, Dutch, were pressing harder at Canton, demanding silver for their tea. The elders muttered that the West was restless again, that barbarians never tired of knocking at the Middle Kingdom's gates. Li Wei listened in silence. He had never seen the sea, only heard stories of it, vast and unpredictable, like the foreign world beyond. But he felt its pull in subtle ways. The price of salt rising, rumors of strange new goods, travelers carrying coins stamped with faces instead of dragons. At noon he paused beneath a banyan tree, unwrapping a parcel of rice and pickled vegetables. His friend Chen Lu joined him, wiping sweat from his brow. "They say the foreigners bring machines," Chen Lu said. "Engines that move without oxen, and ships that breathe fire." Li Wei smiled faintly. "Stories for children." "Perhaps," Chen Lu replied. "But children's stories have a way of becoming truth." They ate in silence, watching dragonflies hover over the water. In the distance, a bell tolled from the temple, its tone deep, deliberate, eternal. The monks there kept records stretching back 1,000 years. Li Wei sometimes wondered what the scrolls would say of their own time, an empire vast and proud, yet standing so still that the world might one day flow around it. When the work was done, he walked home along the path, through bamboo groves, the leaves whispering like rain. His mother waited at the doorway with a bowl of tea. The house was simple, clay walls, paper windows, the faint smell of jasmine and smoke. "Your father spoke of dreams again," she said quietly. "He dreams of soldiers in red coats and cities of glass." Li Wei frowned. "Dreams are only dreams." "Sometimes," she said, "dreams arrive before the future does." That night, a storm rolled over the hills, thunder cracking like the beating of giant drums. Li Wei lay awake, watching lightning flash through the paper screen. For a moment he imagined the world beyond China's borders. Ships of iron, cities of smoke, people whose tongues he could not imagine. He wondered if they ever looked east and thought of the ones who tilled the flooded earth. The storm passed. Rain tapped gently on the roof until sleep came. Far to the north, where rivers froze and forests stretched for miles, another empire stirred, its Tsar dreaming of glory, its people bound to the land like roots beneath snow. And there, in that vast and bitter expanse, a young man named Alexei awoke to a morning colder than steel. Chapter 10. Russia, 1800. Alexei and the Winter Silence. The morning light came reluctantly over the frozen plain. Snow stretched in every direction, glittering under a pale sun that never seemed to rise high enough to warm the world. Alexei trudged through it, the frost biting through his boots, each breath turning to vapor before his face. The air smelled of pine resin and smoke, faint reminders that life still stirred in the endless cold. He was 19, a serf on the estate of Count Baranov, 3 days' ride from St. Petersburg. His family had worked the same frozen soil for generations, sowing rye, mending roofs, cutting timber in exchange for the right to exist. He had never seen the Tsar, but the Tsar's power was as real to him as winter itself, vast, distant, and unrelenting. Behind him, the church bell rang once, its sound dulled by snow. The village stirred, a handful of cottages huddled against the wind, smoke curling upward like grey ribbons. Dogs barked. Children ran barefoot through the snow, laughing despite the cold. Alexei lifted his axe from his shoulder and entered the birch forest. The trees stood white and silent, branches heavy with frost. He found a fallen trunk half buried in snow and began to chop, the rhythm of iron against wood echoing through the stillness. As he worked, he thought of his brother Nikolai, who had run away 2 winters before, said to have joined the army, though others whispered he had fled south to seek freedom. Freedom. The word meant little here. It was something noblemen debated and poets wrote about in Petersburg salons, not something that reached the frozen villages of the north. By midday his arms ached and his stomach growled. He sat on the stump and unwrapped a piece of black bread, frozen hard as stone. He chewed slowly, staring toward the horizon where the forest met the sky, a line as sharp as a blade. The overseer arrived on horseback, fur cloak dusted with snow. "Alexei," he barked. "The Count expects a cart of wood by sundown. No excuses." Alexei nodded, lowering his eyes. "Yes, sir." When the overseer rode away, he muttered softly, "The Count expects much. The forest gives what it will." He finished his work by twilight, his fingers numb, his breath ragged. The sled creaked under the weight of logs as he dragged it toward the village. The sky burned briefly with color, orange bleeding into violet, then swallowed by darkness. That night, in the single-room cottage he shared with his mother, he sat by the fire sharpening his axe. The flames cast shadows on the walls, dancing like ghosts. His mother spoke quietly. "I dreamed of Nikolai again. He was by a river, free and smiling." Alexei looked into the fire. "Dreams are kind," he said. "Reality less so." She sighed. "Still, I pray one day we'll see that river." Outside, the wind howled like an old animal. The world seemed endless, and time moved slowly, as if trapped in the ice itself. Yet change was coming, though none here could name it. In the cities, new ideas flickered like distant lamps. Talk of equality, liberty, and reform whispered through salons and printing houses. Alexei knew none of this. He only knew the sound of the axe and the feel of frost. But one day his children would hear those words, and the empire that had stood for centuries would tremble. The snow fell quietly through the night, covering the footprints of man and horse alike. By dawn, the land was a clean slate once more. Far to the south, beyond mountains and oceans, the sun rose warm and bright over another empire, one where the desert met the sky, and faith was the rhythm of every heartbeat. There, in the ancient city of Isfahan, a young scholar named Parviz opened his eyes to the light filtering through the lattice of his window, unaware that his world too was on the verge of change. Chapter 11, Persia, 1800, Parviz, and the blue dome of Isfahan. The morning sun spilled through the lattice windows, scattering patterns of light across the tiled floor. Parviz sat cross-legged beside his desk, a scroll unrolled before him, the scent of ink and jasmine rising from the paper. Outside, the call to prayer drifted softly through the warm air, 5 tones that stitched the city awake. He was 26, a scholar of astronomy at the madrasa near the Masjid-e-Shah, the great blue-domed mosque that gleamed like a piece of heaven fallen to earth. His family were merchants, once prosperous under the Safavid kings, now modest under the rule of the Qajar dynasty. Persia in 1800 was a shadow of its former glory, a land of poets and ruins, of silk and sorrow, caught between empires that coveted its soul. Parviz dipped his reed pen and marked another figure in the margin. He was charting the movements of Venus, a study his teacher called the mathematics of beauty. The stars, Parviz believed, were the last pure truth, left in a world corrupted by greed. From his courtyard, he could hear his sister Azar tending to the garden, humming a lullaby older than memory. His mother's voice followed, sharp but loving. Don't waste the water, even paradise must be rationed. By midday, the bazaar outside the madrasa filled with life. Merchants shouting, coins clinking, the smell of saffron and roasting lamb thick in the air. Parviz stepped out, scrolls tucked under his arm. The narrow streets shimmered in the heat, every wall a mosaic of turquoise and dust. He stopped at a bookstall where old volumes were stacked like towers. The merchant, a stooped man with ink-stained fingers, greeted him. "Parviz, my astronomer," he said, "still chasing the stars while the world burns." Parviz smiled. Someone must record their patience. The merchant laughed. "Better record the impatience of kings. I hear rumors from the north. Russia stretches her claws again, and from the east, the British sail closer every season. I study what is above," Parviz said. "The rest will change as it always has." "Ah," the merchant replied, "and yet even the stars have fallen before." That evening, Parviz walked to the bridge of Kaju, where the arches reflected perfectly in the still water of the Zayande River. Lanterns hung from the balustrade, glowing amber against the blue twilight. Lovers whispered under the arches. Beggars sang old verses of Rumi and Hafez. He sat and watched the current, thinking of how the river had once fed the gardens of kings, now reduced to a trickle. His country was the same, he thought, rich in beauty, starved of strength. A stranger joined him, a traveler from Shiraz, dusty and sunburned. "You're a scholar," the man said. "Tell me, do the stars speak of peace for Persia?" Parviz looked up. "The stars speak only of time. The rest is for men to decide." The man laughed bitterly. "Then we are poor listeners." As night deepened, the sky unfurled, 1,000 points of light over the darkened city. Parviz recited softly to himself, "Between the heavens and the heart lies all of understanding." He imagined the world beyond these mountains, Europe's smoke, India's spice, China's stillness, and he felt a quiet ache, knowing that Persia's beauty was both its strength and its cage. He turned his eyes upward again. Venus gleamed brightly above the blue dome, serene and distant. He made another note in his mind, as if writing a letter to eternity. And when sleep finally came, it was with the whisper of wind through the plane trees, a sound older than empires, softer than the turning of the stars. Beyond Persia's mountains, the same wind traveled east, carrying the scent of dust and salt to a land where ancient caravans met the sea. There, under the dry sun of Arabia, another morning began, and a young man named Rashid rose to the call of trade and faith, his camel's shadow stretching long across the sand. Chapter 12, Arabia, 1800, Rashid and the Caravan of Winds. The sun rose like a blade over the desert, slicing the horizon into bands of gold and flame. Rashid tightened the saddle strap of his camel, feeling the coarse leather warm beneath his hands. Around him the caravan stretched, 30 men, 40 beasts, and the distant shimmer of dunes that rolled endlessly toward the Red Sea. The desert was both road and test. It offered nothing freely, yet it revealed everything about a man's patience. Rashid was 23, the son of a spice merchant from the port of Jeddah. He had spent most of his life between two worlds, the sea that carried goods from India and Africa, and the sands that led inland toward Mecca, Medina, and beyond. His father often said, "Trade is faith, and faith is trade. Both require trust unseen." This journey was long, a month's crossing toward Damascus, laden with coffee beans from Yemen, frankincense from Oman, and silk from India. Each item bore the scent of another world. The morning air was cool still, but the day promised heat. The camels grumbled softly as they began to move, their bells tinkling like small prayers. Rashid rode near the front, his head wrapped in a white keffiyeh, his eyes scanning the endless line of dunes. By midday the desert shimmered with mirage. The sun pressed down like a hand of fire. Men covered their faces and spoke little. Even the camels seemed subdued. The only sound was the creak of leather and the faint hiss of sand beneath padded feet. As they reached a rocky outcrop, the caravan halted. The leader, an older man named Yusuf, dismounted and raised his hand. "Rest here," he said. "The wind will turn soon." Rashid knelt to pour water from his skin into a brass bowl for the camel. His friend Tariq sat beside him, grinning. "I heard a tale from Aden," he said. "They say the British have ships so large they cast shadows over the sea itself. Their cannons roar like thunder." Rashid smiled wearily. "The sea breeds big stories, perhaps. But the world grows smaller," Tariq said. "Every year, more foreigners trade at Jeddah. One day, they'll reach even these sands." Rashid looked out across the horizon, where heat bent the light into wavering shapes. "The desert swallows everything," he said softly, "even time." When the wind shifted, it came suddenly, hot, sharp, carrying fine grains that stung the skin. The men pulled their scarves tight, eyes narrowed. The camels groaned. A sandstorm, quick and merciless. They huddled behind the rocks, cloaks drawn over their heads. The air roared. For a time the world vanished. Sky, sand, men, all dissolved into one. Rashid closed his eyes and thought of his father's words. Faith is patience in the unseen. When the storm passed, the desert was unrecognizable. The dunes had moved, reshaped by the wind's will. Their tracks were gone. "Which way?" someone asked. Yusuf pointed toward the fading sun. "Always west," he said. "The light will find the way." They traveled until nightfall, stopping at a shallow wadi where a single acacia tree grew, twisted, resilient. As the stars appeared, Rashid looked up at them, thousands, scattered like spilled salt across black velvet. Somewhere beyond those constellations lay the lands his trade touched. India, Africa, Persia, Europe, worlds bound together by roots invisible, yet eternal. He thought of the ships in Jeddah's harbor, of sailors who spoke strange tongues, of the cities rising on foreign shores. He wondered if one day his children would see those places, not as rumors, but as destinations. He lay back on the sand, listening to the camels' slow breathing. The wind whispered through the dunes, carrying the scent of spice and dust. The desert, timeless as ever, kept its secrets. Far beyond Arabia, that same wind crossed the ocean and touched the coasts of India, where monsoon clouds gathered heavy with rain, and in the bustling streets of Calcutta, a young printer named Arjun wiped ink from his fingers and read the first whispers of revolution in a language not his own. Chapter 13. India, 1800. Arjun and the Monsoon Press. The clouds had gathered since dawn, heavy and bruised with rain. By noon, Calcutta was a trembling mirror of puddles, the air thick with the scent of ink, sweat, and wet paper. Arjun pressed the last sheet into the printing press and turned the iron handle until the rollers sighed. He was 24, a printer's apprentice at a small Bengali press tucked behind the old bazaar. His palms were permanently stained black from ink, his shirt patched with ghostly fingerprints of his own labor. The city outside his narrow street pulsed with the rhythm of empire. British soldiers in red coats, palanquins swaying with merchants, cries of hawkers mixing with the clatter of hooves on cobblestone. The year was 1800, and Calcutta stood at the hinge of two worlds, one ancient, one modern, both uneasy with each other. Arjun pulled the printed sheet free. a page from a new Bengali almanac, the Panchang, listing lunar dates and festivals. The press owner, Mr. Jameson, an aging Scotsman with a soft accent and a hard face, leaned over his shoulder. "Careful with the type, lad," he muttered. "These letters are delicate as treaties." "Yes, Sahib," Arjun said, though under his breath the word came out quieter, duller. Respected the old man, even liked him, but he could not ignore the weight that pressed upon every syllable spoken between them. Master and apprentice, ruler and ruled. Outside, the first raindrops fell, slow, heavy, each one darkening the earth like ink upon paper. Arjun stepped to the doorway and watched as people hurried for shelter beneath awnings and banyan trees. The monsoon had arrived. The rain came like music, relentless and warm. He thought of his father, a weaver from Murshidabad, who had lost everything when British looms flooded the markets with cloth too cheap to compete. "They weave with fire," his father had said, "and burn the rest of us." Now Arjun wove words instead of thread, but the rhythm was the same, a craft both fragile and defiant. By evening, the street outside the press was a river. The city glowed in reflections, oil lamps, rickshaws, silhouettes of sailors shouting in a dozen tongues. Arjun carried a stack of freshly printed pages through the downpour, delivering them to a bookseller near College Street. Inside, the shop smelled of paper and damp wood. Scholars huddled beneath lanterns, arguing in English, Persian, and Bengali alike. One of them, a young man in Western clothes, looked up. "You work at the press, don't you?" Arjun nodded. The man lowered his voice. "We're printing more than calendars now. There are new words, essays, ideas, liberty, equality, nation." He smiled faintly. "You'll see them soon enough." Arjun frowned, not out of disapproval, but curiosity. Those words, heavy and foreign, sounded strange in Bengali, like seeds yet to take root. That night, when the rain eased, he returned home through narrow alleys shining with puddles. His mother waited with lentil stew and warm rice. By the flicker of the oil lamp, he read aloud from an English newspaper left behind at the press. The words blurred, but their meaning sank deep. Revolutions in Europe, rumors of rebellion in the Americas, talk of reason and rights. "Do you understand it?" his mother asked softly. "Not all," Arjun admitted, "but it feels important. Like thunder far away." She smiled tiredly. Thunder never stays far forever. He lay awake long after she slept, the rain drumming softly on the roof. Somewhere beyond the monsoon clouds, the stars glowed unseen, the same stars that watched over kings, farmers, and fishermen alike. He thought of the printing press, its slow rhythm, its voice that reached farther than any man could walk. One day, he imagined, these printed words might move mountains. And beyond the mountains, to the east, the rains faded into clear skies above a vast delta of rivers and pagodas, where the bells of Burma called monks to prayer. There, under the shadow of teak forests, a novice named Ong took his first vow of silence, and the world itself seemed to pause. Chapter 14. Burma, 1800, Ong, and the stillness of the bell. The dawn in Burma arrived like a prayer, slow, golden, and wordless. Mist lay over the Irrawaddy River, soft as silk, and the air held the scent of teak wood and rain. From the monastery hill, the bell tolled, deep and resonant, rolling over the valley below. Ong knelt beside the water jar, washing his face before the first chant of the morning. He was 15, newly robed in saffron, his head freshly shaven, his eyes bright with the kind of calm that only youth and faith can share. The monastery was his home now, a refuge of discipline and silence among the dense teak forests north of Ava. Each morning began the same, Sweep the courtyard, light the incense, gather for prayer. The senior monks led the chanting, verses older than kingdoms, their rhythm steady as breathing. The temple walls, gilded and worn by time, caught the first light of dawn, and the faces of Buddha seemed almost to glow from within. Ong's thoughts, though disciplined, sometimes wandered. Beyond the monastery walls lay the village where he had been born, a scattering of bamboo huts beside a rice paddy where his mother still lived. He could still remember her voice singing him to sleep, the smell of sesame oil and smoke clinging to her hands. Now he lived among men who spoke little. The world beyond seemed distant, yet it reached him in whispers. The British in Bengal, the Siamese to the east, the kings of Ava building armies once more. Burma's rulers had long fought to keep their borders whole, but Ong's master, the venerable monk Sayadaw Thet, often said, "All things built by war fall to silence. Only compassion endures." After prayers, Ong joined the novices on the road through the forest to collect alms. The villagers bowed as they passed, offering rice and fruit into their bowls. The path wound through bamboo groves alive with birdsong, then opened into a valley where the river shimmered beneath the sun. An old man tending his oxen paused to bow. "The rains will be kind this year," he said. Ong smiled gently. "May they be kind to all." By midday the monks returned to the monastery. The meal was simple: rice, lentils, mango slices. Afterward, silence. Each monk returned to his cell to meditate, the hum of cicadas rising like a great invisible choir. As Ong sat cross-legged, eyes closed, he thought of the world beyond the forest, the distant hum of kingdoms and trade, of soldiers marching, of ships crossing seas. Yet here time moved differently. Each breath was its own universe. When evening came, he climbed the monastery steps and looked west. The Irrawaddy glowed bronze in the fading light, boats drifting slowly toward Mandalay. The pagodas along the riverbank caught the sunset on their spires. Sayadaw Thet stood beside him, his face lined and calm. "You see that river?" he asked. "Yes, teacher. It flows through all our lives. Once you are part of it, you never leave. The world changes, but the current carries us all toward understanding." Ong bowed his head. "And if the current grows violent, then we must learn to float." As night fell, the sound of the bell returned, low and deep, rolling over the forest, calling all things to stillness. Ong knelt once more, the stars reflected in his eyes. In their shimmer, he imagined distant lands beyond the ocean, places of snow and fire, of machines and prayers, all connected by the same quiet rhythm of humanity. Far to the north, where mountains rose like giants between the clouds, another young man greeted a similar dawn, a Tibetan herder named Dorje, whose world of wind and silence was about to be shaken by the footprints of strangers climbing toward the sky. Chapter 15. Tibet, 1800. Dorje and the Roof of the World. The wind rose before dawn, moaning softly through the mountain passes, like a spirit half asleep. Dorje opened his eyes to a ceiling of yak hide stretched taut over wooden poles. His small hearth glowed faintly, the last embers of the night's fire breathing orange against the cold. Beyond the tent flap the Himalayas loomed, endless, white, and ancient. He was 18, the son of a herder who grazed yaks along the high valleys of Yutsang, near Shigatse. His people lived in rhythm with the mountains, moving with the seasons, chanting prayers to the sky, carving a life out of rock and silence. The morning air cut like glass. He stepped outside, wrapping his tuba tightly, the wool heavy with frost. The horizon blazed pink where the sun touched the snowy peaks. Below him the herd stirred, dark shapes in the mist, snorting clouds of steam. The smell of butter tea drifted from another tent, thick and comforting. Dorje's sister, Lamo, emerged behind him, hair braided with red thread. "Father's gone to the ridge," she said. He saw strangers yesterday, men with pale faces and strange clothes. He frowned. Strangers were rare here. Sometimes traders came from Nepal or Bhutan, their ponies loaded with salt and wool. But pale-faced travelers meant something else. The foreigners who had begun to appear on the edges of the world, sketching maps and claiming mountains. After morning prayers, Dorje climbed the ridge himself. The ground crunched under his boots, frozen solid. The prayer flags tied along the path fluttered wildly, their colors, red, blue, green, yellow, white, snapping in the wind. To move is to pray, his father always said. The mountain hears your steps. At the top, he stopped short. In the distance, near the frozen river, he saw them, 2 men, small against the vastness, leading ponies laden with gear. One carried a brass telescope. The other wore a red coat that gleamed unnaturally bright against the snow. Dorje crouched behind a boulder, heart pounding. He had heard stories of foreign soldiers in India, of merchants who crossed the passes bringing metal tools, and rumors of machines that moved without horses. Yet seeing them here, on the very edge of heaven, made those tales real. He watched as the men paused, looking around, one of them raising a brass cylinder to his eye. They were surveying, perhaps mapping, capturing the shape of his homeland in a language of lines and numbers. When they moved on, Dorje turned back toward camp. His father met him halfway down the slope. "You saw them?" "Yes," Dorje said quietly. 2 men, foreign. His father's face tightened. The wind carries strange things these days. The lamas say the outside world grows hungry. They will come for our mountains too. That evening the family gathered around the fire. The yak butter lamp flickered, shadows dancing across their faces. Dorje's grandmother told old stories of the bodhisattvas who wandered the peaks, of the hidden valleys where time itself stood still. Outside, the wind howled, but within the tent there was warmth and peace. Later, Dorje stepped outside again. The sky was impossibly clear, a black dome pricked with silver. The Milky Way stretched across it like a road of light. He looked toward the ridge where the strangers had walked, and wondered if they looked at the same sky, if they felt as small before it as he did. He pressed his palms together, whispering a prayer, not for protection, but for balance, that the mountain, the wind, and the world beyond would remember their place in the vast order of things. The wind carried his words eastward, down through the passes and valleys, across the plains of Mongolia and the frozen rivers of Siberia, where another people waited at the edge of empire, listening for the promise of change in the quiet between the stars. Chapter 16. Mongolia, 1800, Sarul and the Riders of the Eternal Sky. The dawn came in silence over the steppe, a faint band of silver at the rim of the world, widening into blue. Sarul stood outside his gear, the round felt tent that had sheltered his family for generations. The grass beneath his boots shimmered with frost, the horizon unbroken for 100 miles in every direction. He could smell the horses before he saw them, the warm grassy scent of their breath rising into the cold. He was 20, a herdsman like his father and his father's father before him. The rhythm of his life followed the same eternal pattern. Ride, herd, sing, and sleep beneath the same boundless sky. Yet in the year 1800, even here, in the open heart of Asia, the world was beginning to shift. He saddled his chestnut mare, Tenga, and whistled. The herd moved in a shimmering wave across the plains, manes rippling like fire. The air was crisp and dry, carrying the cry of a distant eagle. Sarul rode hard, wind cutting against his face, his long hair streaming behind him. Each gallop was freedom, raw, wordless, absolute. By midday, he reached the family's summer pasture. where his younger sister milked the mares and poured the frothing air rag into leather bags. His mother sat near the fire, stirring a pot of lamb stew. Smoke rose straight into the floorless sky. "Father went to the governor's camp," she said. "He'll return by nightfall." Sarul nodded. He knew why. The governor's men, agents of the Qing, had come demanding tribute, hides, horses, and grain. Though Mongolia was under Qing rule, the empire's grip was loosening. The officials grew greedier, the nomads more restless. When the sun began to dip, his father returned, weary and silent. "They want more this year," he said at last. "Always more." His mother frowned. "And if we refuse?" "Then soldiers will come," he replied. "And soldiers do not listen." That night, around the fire, they drank fermented mare's milk and sang the old songs, the ones that told of Genghis Khan and the unity of the tribes, when the Mongols had ruled from the Pacific to the Volga. Sarul sang quietly, his voice low but clear, the melody echoing across the plains. Later, he lay outside, gazing up at the Milky Way, which his people called Tengeri Zam, the road of heaven. The stars seemed close enough to touch. He thought of the stories he'd heard from traders, Russian settlers pushing south, Chinese merchants bringing silk and tea, strange men from the west with fire weapons and machines that smoked. His father's words returned to him. The wind cannot be ruled. Sarul closed his eyes, listening to that same wind sweep across the steppe. He dreamed of a day when Mongols would ride free again, not for war, but for memory, for the sky that had never belonged to anyone. By morning, frost had turned the grass to crystal. The herd moved like ghosts through the mist. And far to the east, beyond the steppe, the same sun broke through a curtain of cloud over the islands of the rising sun. In Edo, Japan, the sound of a drum called soldiers to formation, while in the narrow streets of Kyoto, a poet dipped his brush into ink, capturing the fleeting moment between autumn and forever. Chapter 17, Japan, 1800, Haruko, and the Autumn Poem. The morning mist had not yet lifted from the narrow lanes of Kyoto. The air was sweet with the smell of rain and persimmons ripening in small garden courtyards. Haruko knelt beside the veranda, grinding ink with slow, practiced motions, the stone making a soft, rhythmic sound that filled the silence of the house. She was 28, a poet and calligrapher's daughter. Her family had once served the court during the height of the Tokugawa peace, but the centuries had worn their status thin. Her father now sold his art to merchants, his brush guided more by necessity than inspiration. Still, he carried himself with the calm dignity of old Kyoto, the kind that could not be bought or measured. Outside, the temple bells chimed the hour. Somewhere down the street, a shamisen played, its melody drifting through the mist like a thread of silk. Haruko dipped her brush and began her morning work, copying verses for a small poetry anthology being compiled by a local patron. Autumn again, leaves fall with no sound at all, the heart follows. Her brush moved gently across the paper, each stroke deliberate. Poetry, her father always said, was a form of breathing. To write beautifully was to live beautifully, even if only for a line. When the servant announced that a visitor had come, Haruko laid her brush aside and composed herself. The guest, a young samurai named Saito, entered with a respectful bow. He was one of the many ronin who now wandered the land, swordsmen without masters, relics of an age that was fading into the quiet order of Edo rule. "I come with a letter from your cousin in Edo," he said, untying a scroll from his sash. "He writes of scholars who speak of change, of the world outside our islands, growing restless." Haruko accepted the letter and read it silently. It spoke of Dutch ships in Nagasaki, of foreign books on science and navigation smuggled through the ports. of whispers that the Western world was inventing machines that could move on their own. To her, it felt like hearing of a storm across an ocean, distant but inevitable. "My cousin exaggerates," she said softly. "The shogun's walls are high." Saito smiled faintly. "Walls crumble, Lady Haruko, even those built with silence." When he left, the house grew still again. Haruko returned to her work, but her brush hesitated. Outside, the rain began to fall, gentle, constant. The ink on her paper bled slightly at the edges, blurring the characters until they looked almost alive. That evening she walked to the Kamo River. The streets glowed with paper lanterns, their reflections trembling on the wet stones. Children chased after fireflies. Priests passed by, their robes dark with rain. Haruko paused on the bridge, watching the water flow beneath her. The river had been flowing since before Kyoto was a city, before emperors, before shoguns, before even words. She thought of her country, so quiet, so ordered, yet balanced on a thin thread between beauty and decay. The world beyond the seas might be changing, but here, life moved like a poem, measured, serene, waiting. She whispered a verse to the night air. "The world changes, but this river remembers every moon before." The current carried her words away, as the mist thickened once more, softening the edges of the city into dream. And far to the west, where the same moon rose over the cold forests of northern Europe, another young soul, a musician named Ansel in Vienna, tuned his violin by candlelight, unaware that his music would one day echo across centuries and continents. Chapter 18. Vienna, 1800. Ansel and the Music of Shadows. The lamplight flickered in the narrow window of the boarding house, trembling in rhythm with the wind outside. Ansel drew his bow across the strings of his violin, the note long and uncertain, a question held in sound. He adjusted the peg, sighed, and tried again. He was 21, a musician's apprentice in the heart of Vienna, a city overflowing with sound and sorrow, where every alley echoed with music, and every tavern birthed a genius. The year 1800 was an age of transition. Mozart was gone, Haydn was aging, and a young composer named Beethoven was rewriting the rules of harmony. Ansel, like many, lived in the shadow of greatness. His room was bare except for the violin, a small writing desk, and a candle guttering low. Outside, the muffled clip-clop of carriages passed along the cobblestone street. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and wet iron from the Danube's mist. In the morning, he would play in the orchestra pit at the theatre An der Wien, the same stage where Beethoven had unveiled his new symphonies to startled audiences. Ansel often sat in the back, bow poised, trying not to lose himself in the immensity of it. The music was like thunder, wild, unpredictable, too alive for rules. He still remembered the first time he heard it. The opening chords had felt like the world cracking open, a storm inside a church. When the performance ended, there had been silence, then shouts, and then applause that rolled like waves, and Ansel, clutching his violin, had whispered, "So this is what the future sounds like." Tonight, he practiced quietly. The melody he played was his own, soft, searching, imperfect. It spoke of things he could not name: hunger, longing, the ache of being young in a city that seemed to breathe genius with every dawn. He paused, flexing his sore fingers, and reached for a sheet of paper. On it, half a sonata waited, unfinished, uncertain. He wrote a few more notes, then stopped again. The rain began outside, gentle at first, then steady, drumming softly against the windowpane. Downstairs, laughter drifted up from the tavern. Someone was singing a folk tune in a thick Bavarian accent. The smell of stew and cheap wine floated through the cracks in the floor. Ansel smiled faintly. The music of the city was everywhere, in the laughter, in the footsteps, even in the rain. Perhaps greatness, he thought, was not something you reached, but something that passed through you like wind through strings. He played one last line, letting the final note hang in the dim room until it vanished. The candle's flame bent and went out. For a moment, darkness held everything, the silence, the echo, the breath after sound. And when morning came, he would walk again through Vienna's waking streets. The smell of bread and rain in the air, the church bells tolling across the roofs. Far to the west, beyond the Rhine, beyond the restless borders of Europe, a different kind of revolution stirred, one not of music, but of ideals. In the narrow streets of Paris, under the shadow of a new emperor's ambition, a seamstress named Elodie would begin her day, needle in hand, as history itself was being stitched anew. Chapter 19, France 1800, Elodie and the Thread of Empire. The first light of morning fell through the narrow window of the attic, cutting across the dust like a blade of pale gold. Elodie's fingers were already busy at the needle before the church bells began to toll. Each stitch drew the thread through rough fabric with a sound that reminded her of breathing, steady, necessary. She was 23, a seamstress in the Marais district of Paris. Her hands were small and scarred, pricked from years of work, her shoulders hunched from hours bent over cloth. Yet her eyes held the same brightness that had carried her through the revolution, the terror, and the restless calm that followed. Below, the city stirred. Cartwheels clattered on the cobblestones. Vendors shouted the first calls of the day, and the faint scent of baking bread mingled with smoke. Paris, in 1800, was a place both haunted and reborn. Its walls still scarred from cannon fire, yet its salons alive again with talk of ambition and glory. On the table beside Elodie lay a half-finished uniform jacket, deep blue, trimmed in gold. The man who had commissioned it had spoken proudly, a lieutenant in Bonaparte's new army, soon to march for Italy. He had paid in advance, in crisp new francs that still smelled of ink. Her needle paused. So many uniforms, she thought. So many young men wrapped in fine cloth to hide the fear beneath. She tied off the thread and reached for another piece of fabric, scarlet lining, imported and costly. Her employer, Madame Fournier, came up the stairs, her heavy skirts brushing the walls. "Quickly, Elodie," she said. "The officers pay well, but they don't wait." "Yes, madame," she replied. When the older woman left, Elodie allowed herself a breath. Outside, snowflakes drifted past the window, settling on the rooftops like a memory of peace. She thought of her brother, killed 5 years before at Toulon, his body never found. The revolution had taken him, then the Directory, and now this new empire hungered for sons again. By afternoon, she carried the finished coat down to the street. The tailor's shop bustled with customers, soldiers, merchants, wives of officials who wanted to look respectable under the new order. The air was thick with perfume and coal smoke. As she handed over the jacket, the young officer smiled. "You have skill, mademoiselle," he said. "A woman like you should sew for Paris herself, or perhaps for the Empress, when there is one." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps when the wars are over," he laughed. "Wars are how men earn peace." She watched him go, his boots striking the cobblestones with purpose, his youth wrapped in illusion. That evening, Elodie climbed the stairs back to her attic. From her window, she could see the city's rooftops glowing under the orange lamps, the Seine winding black and slow beneath the bridges. Somewhere beyond those streets, Bonaparte planned his empire, a world reshaped by his will. She lit a candle, its flame steady despite the draught, and began a new piece of work, a simple dress, soft gray. meant for no one but herself. For once, her stitches were slow, almost tender, each one a small act of defiance, proof that beauty still belonged to ordinary hands. When she finished, she set the needle down and listened. The bells of Notre Dame rang through the night, solemn and distant. She thought of the France her brother had dreamed of, equal, free, and just, and wondered if such a nation could ever be stitched back together from so many seams. Outside, the snow fell quietly over Paris, covering the old wounds of revolution in white. And far to the south, across mountains and seas, another city awoke under sunlight and salt, a port where the Mediterranean met the desert. There, amid the noise of merchants and sailors, a young Greek named Nikos loaded amphorae onto a ship, his thoughts already drifting toward the unknown horizon. Chapter 20. The Mediterranean, 1800, Nikos, and the Horizon of Salt. The harbor of Piraeus shimmered beneath a pale morning sun. Nikos hoisted the amphora onto his shoulder, the coarse clay biting into his skin. All around him, the port stirred to life. Gulls screaming, sailors shouting in Greek, Arabic, and Italian, ropes creaking against wooden masts. The smell of salt, fish, and tar mingled into something sharp enough to taste. He was 29, a merchant son from Chios turned sailor by necessity. Greece, though still bound under Ottoman rule, had always belonged to the sea. Freedom here was measured not by land but by wind, and Nikos had spent most of his life chasing both. Faster, boy. The ship's captain barked from the deck, his voice carrying over the din. The tide waits for no one. Nikos grinned and heaved the amphora into place. The vessel, a sturdy brig called Thetis, was bound for Alexandria, its hold heavy with olive oil, pottery, and dreams of profit. He paused to wipe his brow, gazing out over the blue expanse of the Aegean. The sunlight flashed on the waves like scattered coins. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay Egypt, the same land where Alexander had once walked and Napoleon's troops now lingered, carving their names into history's walls. By noon the sails were unfurled, white against the endless blue. The wind filled them with a low, living sigh. The port receded, the shouts, the laughter, the cries of farewell, until there was only the rhythm of the sea and the creak of the hull. The voyage south was long but steady. Days blurred into a pattern of labor and silence. The crew spoke little, saving breath for the work of rope and oar. Nikos spent his nights on deck, staring at the stars, ancient guides that had led sailors for millennia. He thought of his father's words. The sea remembers every man, but not every man is remembered by the sea. On the third day, the wind turned fierce. Black clouds rose suddenly from the west, and the air tasted of iron. "Storm!" someone shouted. The crew sprang into motion, reefing the sails, tying the ropes. The sea, moments ago gentle, became a living thing, roaring, heaving. Nikos gripped the mast, rain stinging his face. The waves rose like walls, and the ship plunged and groaned, each impact a test of faith. A barrel broke loose, crashing across the deck. A man slipped and vanished into the dark, his scream swallowed by thunder. For hours they fought. When the storm finally passed, dawn came weak and gray. The ship was battered but afloat, the men exhausted but alive. They buried the lost sailor at sea, his shroud sinking quietly into the calm that followed. As the sun rose again, the coastline of Africa appeared on the horizon, golden and unreal in the haze. Alexandria. Nikos stood at the bow, salt crusted on his lips, eyes fixed on the distant shore. The lighthouse was gone, destroyed centuries before, but its memory still lived in every sailor's mind. When they docked, the air was hot and sweet with spice. Traders shouted in Arabic, Greek, French, and Italian. Camels groaned beneath the weight of cargo. Nico stepped onto the dock, the stone warm underfoot, and felt something he hadn't in years, the faint tremor of destiny. In a tavern near the quay, he heard whispers of Egypt's new rulers, of the French scholars measuring the pyramids, of Ottoman officials returning to power, of the old gods sleeping beneath the sand while new ones claimed their place. That night, he sat by the water, watching lanterns flicker on the ships like small, wandering stars. The world, he thought, was changing faster than any tide. Empires shifting, borders dissolving, and men like him forever adrift between them. He picked up a pebble, smoothed by the waves, and held it in his palm. "The sea will always be free," he murmured, "and so must I." Above him, the stars shimmered, the same that had guided sailors from Phoenicia to Byzantium, from Venice to Cairo. Their light stretched onward, across the dunes of Africa and the jungles beyond, toward another man standing on a distant shore, where the Southern Cross burned in the sky and the horizon whispered of an even wider world. Chapter 21, The Cape, 1800, Amara and the Southern Cross. The dawn broke pink over Table Mountain, the clouds clinging like smoke to its flat crown. Amara carried a basket of oranges to the harbor, her bare feet silent on the cool sand. The gulls cried above her, circling the ships anchored offshore, Dutch, English, and Portuguese, their flags snapping in the wind. The sea smelled of salt, oil, and tar. The air was alive with languages she barely understood. She was 22, born of two worlds. Her mother a freed slave from Mozambique, her father a sailor from Lisbon, who had vanished years ago into the wide blue unknown. She worked now as a fruit seller by the docks of the Cape Colony, trading smiles for coins, stories for survival. The year 1800 found the Cape caught between empires. The Dutch East India Company had collapsed and the British had taken the port, its ships now ruling the waters of the south. Soldiers in red coats filled the streets, drinking, laughing, paying for supplies before sailing on to India. Amara moved among them with quiet grace. Her oranges were sweet, her laughter sweeter, and though most men saw her as another face in the market, she listened to their accents, their gossip, their dreams. The world passed through this harbor, and she gathered it like seashells, stories of wars in Europe, revolts in the Americas, discoveries of lands beyond maps. As she handed fruit to a weary sailor, he said, "They say there's a new star in the sky tonight, bright as fire. Sailors swear it's an omen." She smiled. "We have our own stars," she said, pointing to the southern sky. "They never lead men astray." He looked puzzled. "You mean that cross of light?" "Yes," she said softly. "It's called the Sukun Taba, the traveler's sign. It tells us where home is, even when the world changes." By midday, the market was a whirl of color and sound. Asosa farmers selling grain, Malay cooks stirring spiced stews, sailors bartering for tobacco and ivory. The city was a patchwork of tongues and tempers, stitched together by necessity. As the sun set, Amara walked along the shore. The tide glowed red with the last light of day, and the sails of the departing ships caught fire in the distance. She sat on a rock, letting the wind tangle her hair, and thought of her mother's stories, of the lands across the water, where people walked beneath the same stars and prayed in 100 names. She whispered a song her mother had taught her, a lullaby in a language half forgotten. "Winds of the sea, carry me softly. Home is the place the stars remember." Behind her, the lights of Cape Town shimmered, a young city built on old bones, its stones still warm from the footprints of slaves, its streets now echoing with the boots of empire. She looked once more to the sky. The Southern Cross hung low, glittering like a promise. Somewhere beyond that horizon, she thought, ships sailed toward India, China, England, places she would never see, yet somehow belonged to through the stories that passed through her hands each morning. She smiled, closed her eyes, and let the sound of the waves lull her into peace. Far to the east, across the Indian Ocean, dawn broke again, over the island of Java, where the air was thick with spice, and the ground trembled with the footsteps of empire. There, amid jungles and volcanic peaks, a young man named Waira stepped barefoot into the dew, unaware that his homeland was about to change forever. Chapter 22. Java, 1800. Waira and the island of smoke. The first light of morning came through the palms like gold broken into dust. Waira crouched beside the river, washing the sleep from his face. The water was cool, running clear from the volcanic hills that ringed the valley. Birds called from the canopy, shrill, bright, alive, and somewhere the far-off rumble of Mount Merapi rolled like a slow heartbeat through the land. He was 20, son of a farmer near Yogyakarta, where the soil was black and fertile as ink. His village clung to the shadow of two worlds, the old Javanese kingdom that still spoke of spirits and ancestors, and the new Dutch rulers who had carved the island into lines of profit. Each morning, Waira worked the rice fields beside his father. The paddies shimmered like mirrors under the sky. The air smelled of wet earth and young grain. Buffaloes plodded through the mud, their skin slick with sunlight. "Hold steady, Waira," his father said, driving the wooden plow deeper. "The earth remembers careful hands." But the earth also remembered pain. Dutch tax collectors had come last month, demanding a larger share of the harvest. Some families had nothing left to pay but their daughters' jewelry or their own labor. Waira's mother had hidden a handful of rice in a clay jar beneath the floor, insurance against the next visit. By midday he rested under a banana tree, sharing palm sugar with his friend Dewa. "They say the Dutch will build a new road to the coast," Dewa said. "For trade." "For control," Waira replied. Dewa shrugged. "Trade, control, they both come with soldiers." In the afternoon, drums echoed faintly from the Kraton, the Sultan's palace. The Sultan ruled in name, but the Dutch now pulled the strings, their officials seated in cool stone offices, while Javanese peasants sweated in the fields. Still, people whispered that resistance was growing in the hills. Old loyalties were awakening, stirred by songs that spoke of freedom wrapped in shadow. When night fell, Waira helped his mother light the oil lamp. The scent of clove and jasmine filled their home. She hummed softly, an old song her grandmother had taught her. The mountain sleeps, the river dreams, but the people remember. After the meal, Waira stepped outside. The stars above Java were fierce and close, their light falling like ash on the wide dark of the jungle. The volcano smoked in the distance, a thin thread of gray rising against the moon. He wondered if the mountain felt the same restlessness he did, the slow gathering heat beneath a still surface. "Someday," he murmured, "this island will wake, and when it did, the world would hear." The wind shifted then, carrying the scent of cloves out to sea, across the endless Indian Ocean, over the ships that threaded its trade routes, toward a new coast where red sands met white surf. There, in a far-off land called New Holland, a man named Edward knelt beside a strange tree, sketching leaves no European had ever seen, as the southern wind whispered of worlds still unclaimed. Chapter 23. New Holland, 1800. Edward and the land beneath strange stars. The dawn light spilled across the red sand, like embers scattered by a god's hand. Edward knelt in the dust, sketching the outline of a eucalyptus leaf in his worn notebook. Above him, parrots screeched in bursts of color, green, gold, and crimson, flitting through branches of trees that bled pale resin when cut. The air smelled of salt and sap, the world raw and vast beyond comprehension. He was 30, a naturalist from London, hired by the Royal Society to explore the coasts of this newly charted continent, a place they called New Holland, though the name would not last. To the people who had walked here for tens of thousands of years, it needed no name at all. It was simply country. The British colony at Port Jackson still clung to the edge of the world, a handful of weathered huts, convicts in chains, officers dreaming of empire. But Edward lived beyond its reach, among the forests and sandstone ridges west of the settlement, driven by wonder more than duty. He drew quickly, tracing the long, narrow leaves, the odd twisted seeds. "It grows against every rule," he murmured, half to himself. "Even its shadow bends differently." Nearby, a young Wiradjuri man named Jandamara watched silently, leaning on a spear. They had met weeks ago when Edward's camp ran short on water. Since then, they shared an unspoken truce, curiosity for curiosity. Jandamara stepped closer. "You draw the tree?" he asked in slow English. "Yes," Edward replied. "We do not have trees like this in my country." Jandamara tilted his head. "You do not have this country." Edward smiled faintly, then closed his notebook. "No," he said, "we do not." They walked together to the edge of the ridge, where the world opened wide, endless plains stretching to the horizon, the land veined with rivers that glimmered like serpents in the light. The heat shimmered, blurring earth and sky until they became Edward had traveled the world, through jungles, across deserts, yet nowhere had ever felt so ancient, so watchful. The silence here was not emptiness, but presence. Even the stones seemed alive with memory. That evening, as the sun bled into the western horizon, he built a small fire. The stars appeared, unfamiliar, fierce, impossibly close. The constellations of his northern home were gone here. The Southern Cross reigned. He took out his notebook again and wrote by firelight. "This land resists the mind's order. Its trees grow from fire. Its animals leap instead of run. Its sky turns upside down. Yet there is harmony here, a kind of law older than reason. I think perhaps the earth remembers more than we ever will." Jandamara said something softly in his own tongue and pointed to the horizon. Edward followed his gaze. In the distance, faint smoke curled, not from their fire, but another, unseen. "Others?" Edward asked. "Always others," Jandamara replied. "You see only what the land allows." The fire crackled, throwing long shadows across their faces. For a moment, two worlds shared one silence, the explorer and the keeper, the newcomer and the eternal. As the night deepened, Edward lay back and watched the stars wheel above him, strange and bright. He felt both smaller and more complete than ever before. Somewhere far across the ocean, the same stars shimmered over another coast, the edge of a vast continent carved by ice, where a ship creaked through fog, and a young sailor named Elias wrote in his log, "We have reached the end of the journey of humankind, endless, yearning, and fragile, continued beneath the same stars, from fire to frost, from silence to song." Chapter 24. The Antarctic, 1800, Elias and the White Silence. The air was sharp as glass. The sea hissed against ice that rose in jagged walls taller than cathedrals, gleaming blue in the weak light. Elias gripped the rail of the Resolute, breath misting in the frigid wind. Around him, the crew moved slowly, their faces hidden behind scarves stiff with frost. Every sound seemed swallowed, the creak of the ship, the groan of the ice, until the world itself felt held between heartbeats. He was 27, a sailor from Bristol, hardened by years at sea, but unprepared for this kind of emptiness. They had sailed south beyond the maps, past the roaring 40s and screaming 50s, into a realm of pale sun and endless white. The captain's charts ended weeks ago. The compass spun wildly. Only the stars gave them any truth, and even they seemed distant here. "Hold fast, lads," the captain shouted from the quarterdeck. "We're the first to see it. Remember that." Elias looked toward the horizon. The ice stretched without end. Snow fell soundlessly, as if the world were forgetting itself. He thought of the ports he'd left behind, Lisbon's warmth, the chatter of women in Cape Town, the golden sands of distant islands. Now there was nothing but this, a place untouched by time, where even the wind seemed older than language. That night, the crew anchored in a small inlet between two ice floes. They built a fire on the deck, using whale oil and driftwood carried from the north. The flames sputtered, struggling against the cold. Elias wrote in his logbook by the faint light, "This land is silence made solid. We move through a world of ghosts, the sea frozen, the sky hollow, our own breath the only proof of life. Yet I cannot look away. It feels like standing at the edge of creation itself." He paused, his pen trembling from the chill. From the corner of his eye he caught movement, a dark shape against the snow, a seal perhaps, or something larger. He stepped to the bow and peered into the pale glow. The shape was gone, leaving only the sigh of the ice. Sleep came fitfully. In his dreams, he walked across a plain of light, where the stars burned below his feet, not above. He felt the weight of history, every journey, every life, converging into this vast stillness. When dawn returned, the captain ordered them north. "No man can live where even the sun forgets to rise," he said. Elias stood at the stern as the ship turned back toward the open sea. The ice cliffs receded, swallowed by fog, until they were no more than memory. He closed his log and whispered to the cold air, "The end of the world is not death. It is silence." The Resolute sailed north again, carrying its frozen stories toward warmer seas, toward ports filled with laughter, spice, and music. And as it crossed the equator, weeks later, the winds carried the faint scent of rain and soil, the living breath of a continent where drums beat under endless sky, and the voices of many peoples rose in song. There, amid the forests of West Africa, a griot named Kande prepared to tell a story, not of kings or wars, but of the world itself and of the invisible threads that bound every soul from ice to fire, from dusk to dawn. Chapter 25, West Africa, 1800, Kande and the Song of the World. The drums began before the sun rose. Low and deep, they rolled across the forest canopy like distant thunder, a rhythm older than speech, carrying through mist and mango trees, through the sleeping village of Kumbe, waking people one by one. Kande, the griot, sat before the dying fire, his kora resting in his lap. The instrument gleamed with dew, its gored body reflecting the faint red of the coals. He was 50, his beard silvered, his eyes alive with the patience of memory. His voice had carried the histories of his people since before he could write his own name, though words were not his to own, only to keep alive. As he plucked the first strings, the sound shimmered in the cool air, clear as water, steady as time. Children crept from the huts, faces still heavy with sleep. Women came with baskets on their heads, pausing to listen. Even the men, already sharpening hoes for the fields, stopped for a heartbeat. He sang softly in Mandinka, voice worn smooth by years of storytelling. The earth turns, the river flows, but the song remembers all. Today he would tell the story of the world, or as he called it, the long breath. He had heard fragments of it from travelers and traders, news of faraway wars, empires rising and falling, strange men in coats of red and blue carving borders, in places they did not understand. "They say ships have come again," one boy whispered. "With guns and gold." Kanda nodded. "Yes, they come and go. But the sea stays." He struck another chord. The music seemed to weave the morning together. Smoke from fires curling upward, light breaking through the palm fronds, the scent of rain still clinging to the air. He spoke of kingdoms, Mali and Songhai, of Ashanti and Dahomey, of the ancestors who built walls of stone, and those who walked barefoot but carried wisdom greater than kings. His voice deepened as he sang of the years when the great ships came like locusts, taking sons and daughters across the water. The people listened, silent, the rhythm of the drum a heartbeat beneath his words. But his song did not end in sorrow. "The world is wide," he said, "but its stories are one river. The snow speaks to the sand, the mountain to the sea. The wind carries all names." He told them of faraway lands, of islands with red flowers that grew in the ocean's heart, of white mountains that swallowed the sky, of people who mapped the stars but forgot how to listen to them. As the sun climbed higher, his voice grew softer. "One day," he said, "the songs of all peoples will find each other again. The river will remember its source." The drums faded. The village returned to its work, but the melody lingered, threading through the hum of life. Kande sat alone for a moment, gazing toward the western horizon, where the ocean shimmered, endless and unknowable. He plucked one final note from the kora, a sound that seemed to hang between this world and the next. And far across that ocean, carried by wind and wave, morning touched another shore, a new continent rising into light, where a woman named Isabel stepped barefoot onto the red earth of Brazil, and history itself began to hum with the same familiar rhythm, the song of memory and the promise of tomorrow. Chapter 26, Brazil, 1800, Isabel and the River of Gold. The jungle woke before the sun. Parrots screamed in the canopy. Monkeys bickered unseen, and the air hung thick with the smell of rain and fruit. Isabel pushed aside a broad leaf and stepped onto the riverbank, the hem of her skirt heavy with dew. The water moved slow and wide, bronze as the morning sky. She was 30, daughter of a Portuguese trader and a Tupi mother living in the town of Belém, where the Amazon met the Atlantic. Her skin held the color of both her worlds, and her heart belonged to neither fully. Each day she walked the river path to sell herbs, tobacco, and woven baskets in the market. The forest provided, as it always had, but the world was changing even here, beneath the eternal green. Portuguese soldiers marched through the settlements now, mapping, taxing, claiming. Jesuit missionaries spoke of heaven, while merchants spoke of sugar and gold. At the market, Isabel set down her baskets beside a spice cellar. The air shimmered with smells: cinnamon, roasted coffee, saltfish, and smoke. A sailor from Lisbon haggled over cacao pods, his accent thick and careless. "You speak well for an Indian woman," he said, surprised. "I listen more than you speak," Isabel answered coolly, tying her bundle shut. He laughed, but she had already turned away. Outside the market, the church bell rang, a dull iron sound that carried over the roofs of the settlement out toward the jungle. Isabel lifted her eyes to the endless wall of green and thought of her mother's stories, of spirits that lived in rivers, of trees that spoke to those who listened. That night, a storm gathered. The rain fell heavy and warm, drumming against the roof. Isabel stood in the doorway, watching lightning crawl across the sky, Her father's old map hung on the wall beside her, a crude sketch of the Amazon's many veins, labeled Terra Incognita. She smiled bitterly. For those who had lived here forever, there was nothing unknown about this land. It was the mapmakers who were lost. When the storm passed, the air smelled of wet earth and life renewed. She walked to the river, carrying a small candle in a clay holder. The moonlight touched the surface in silver ripples. She whispered her mother's words, an old blessing for safe journeys, and let the flame drift downstream. The candle floated away, its light fading slowly into the dark. The river moved onward, through jungle and plain, past gold mines and hidden villages, past dreams and greed alike, until it met the sea, and the sea carried it farther still across the great Atlantic. And on the opposite shore, in a world of fog and factory smoke, that same sea whispered against the cliffs of Ireland, where a young man named Seamus rose from his cot in a stone cottage and stepped into the grey dawn, chasing a hope as fragile and unyielding as the tide itself. Chapter 27. Ireland, 1800. Seamus and the grey horizon was all mist and quiet. Seamus stepped out of the cottage, boots sinking into the damp earth, his breath white against the pale air. The hills of County Clare rolled away beneath the fog, soft and endless, dotted with sheep and the smoke of distant hearths. Behind him the cottage door creaked open, his mother's voice calling softly, "Don't forget your bread, boy." He smiled, took the rough loaf from her hand, and kissed her cheek. "I'll be back before dark," he said, though he wasn't sure he would. The year was 1800, and Ireland's heart was weary. The rebellion of '98 had ended in blood, its dream of freedom buried beneath the boots of empire. The Act of Union had been passed, England and Ireland joined under one crown. But for the poor, the change meant little. Hunger still stalked the hills. Rents still rose like tides. Seamus was 21, a tenant farmer's son, with calloused hands and restless eyes. His family worked a small patch of land they didn't own, paying rent to an English landlord who'd never seen it. Most days were the same: dig, sow, pray, endure. But lately rumors had begun to drift through the village, of ships leaving for America, where land was cheap, and freedom was not a dream, but a frontier. He walked along the narrow track toward the cliffs, the wind carrying the scent of peat and sea. The Atlantic roared below, grey and alive. He had always loved this sound, wild, eternal, the heartbeat of something larger than kings. At the edge, he found his friend Eowyn, waiting with a small sack slung over his shoulder. "So it's true," Seamus said. Eowyn nodded. "There's a ship leaving from Cork next week, bound for New York. They're taking laborers, farmers, builders, anyone with a back strong enough to last the voyage." Seamus stared at the sea. The idea of leaving made his stomach twist, but the idea of staying twisted it more. "And if we die on the way?" he asked. Eowyn grinned. "Then at least we'll die moving." That evening, Seamus returned home in silence. His mother sat by the fire, mending an old shawl. The smell of stew filled the air, thin but warm. He watched the flames flicker, thinking of his father, gone 3 winters now, his body buried on the hill overlooking the fields he'd never owned. "Ma," he said finally, "if I go, I can send money. Maybe enough to buy our land one day." She didn't look up. "The sea takes more than it gives, Seamus." "I know," he said softly. "But the land takes too." The next morning, he packed his few belongings, a rosary, his father's pipe, and a scrap of linen embroidered with his mother's initials. He walked once more to the cliffs and looked west. The horizon was grey. He whispered a prayer, calling, half to God, half to the sea, and turned toward the road that led to Cork. Behind him, the waves crashed against the stone, a sound that had echoed since the beginning of time. Before him lay the promise of another world, one he could not yet imagine. And far beyond that grey horizon, across the same ocean that had carried so many before him, dawn was rising over the eastern coast of the Americas, where cities hummed, forests whispered, and a new century waited, uncertain and alive. In its quiet heart, a young woman named Clara opened a window in Boston and let in the cold light of morning. Unaware that the same wind, now touching her face, had crossed the world to bring the stories of countless lives to her doorstep. Chapter 28. America, 1800. Clara. The frost on the window caught the dawn like lace. Clara pressed her hand to the glass and felt the cold hum through her fingertips. Boston was waking. The sound of hooves on cobblestone, the distant toll of a church bell, and somewhere a ship's horn crying over the harbor. She was 24, a teacher at a small school on Beacon Hill. Her life, though modest, belonged to a new country still learning how to speak in its own voice. The American Revolution was a generation past, but its echoes still stirred in every conversation, in every sermon, in every heartbeat that dared to believe in freedom's unfinished promise. She moved to the small stove, kindling a fire with trembling fingers. The room was plain, a single bed, a writing desk, a shelf of worn books. Yet on that shelf lay her pride, a copy of the Federalist Papers beside a small leather-bound volume of poetry by Phyllis Wheatley. Her father had called both dangerous. One stirs minds, the other stirs hearts. But Clara believed the two were never meant to be apart. When the fire caught, she poured tea and opened her journal. Her pen moved quickly, scratching in the pale light. The world feels restless, as if every wind carries both promise and unease. The nation grows, but not all its children are free. Perhaps liberty is a door we opened before we learned how to step through. At the schoolhouse, children arrived in twos and threes. Sons of merchants, daughters of dockworkers, a few freed black families who had come north in search of peace. Clara greeted them with warmth and ink-stained fingers. On the chalkboard, she wrote a line from Scripture, "The truth shall make you free." The harbor fog rolled in. Through the open window, she could hear sailors shouting orders, their accents from everywhere. England, Ireland, Africa, the Caribbean. Boston had become a crossroads of the world. After class, she walked down toward the docks. The smell of tar and seaweed filled the air. Ships creaked at anchor, some bound for Europe, others returning from the Indies. A group of Irish immigrants stood near the quay, their faces pale and uncertain. One of them, a young man with tired eyes, looked up as she passed. He could have been Seamus's brother, or Seamus himself, freshly arrived from across the ocean, chasing the same fragile dream. Their eyes met briefly, and in that instant Clara felt the invisible thread of the world tightening. All the journeys, all the losses, all the hopes crossing here at this harbor. By evening she returned home. The fire had gone out, and the room was dim. She lit a candle and began to write again, the ink glistening like midnight. "Perhaps the world is not divided by nations," she wrote, "but by those who remember and those who forget. History is a single breath, moving through many lungs. Somewhere, tonight, a mother hums the same lullaby sung in another tongue, and the stars, indifferent but kind, listen to us all." Outside, the wind rose from the sea, carrying with it the scents of salt, iron, and distant rain. It crossed fields and forests, mountains and deserts, the same current that touched every life from Edo to Cairo, from the Andes to the frozen south. And in that wind, faint and eternal, one could almost hear Candace's words carried across oceans. The world is wide, but its stories are one river. The river flowed on, unseen but unbroken, winding into the final chapter of the century. A quiet reflection beneath the turning stars, where the narrator's voice would return, gathering every story into one great breath of time. Chapter 29, Epilogue. Night settled across the turning earth. From the snows of Siberia to the jungles of Brazil, from the red deserts of Australia to the grey harbors of Boston, the world exhaled together, slow, deep, and human. Fires dimmed. Voices softened. The great wheel of time turned without sound. The river of stories flowed unseen, linking every life it had touched. Kofi's drums, Amira's prayers, Takeshi's tide, Parvis's stars, Haruko's rain, Clara's ink, all threads in the same tapestry stretched across centuries, glimmering faintly beneath the same sky. The old griot's words drifted once more through the wind. The world is wide, but its stories are one river. Above, the constellations spun in silence. The Southern Cross hung low, mirrored by the Northern Star. Between them, the thin breath of the Milky Way shimmered like the path between waking and sleep. A fisherman whispered a prayer to the sea. A child in Edo dreamed of drums. A monk in Burma sat in stillness. A woman in Paris sewed beneath a candle flame, each stitch a heartbeat. A sailor wrote the last line of his log before the lantern burned out. And across it all, the voice of the narrator returned, not speaking to any one place, but to all of them, softly, as though cradling the entire century in his hands. The year 1800 was not one story, but 1,000 small awakenings. Empires dreamed of permanence while the people dreamed of tomorrow. In fields and palaces, deserts and cities, the same breath moved through all, the longing to live, to love, to endure. History is not the sound of kings, but the quiet rhythm of hearts that beat unseen. The night deepened, the stars blurred, and as sleep settled over the world, the river continued its endless journey, carrying every name, every hope, every small, stubborn spark of life forward into the next dawn. If you are sleeping already, sleep well. If you are listening, may the rest of your night be easy. Subscribe to History for Sleep and let the next